you, Andrea. I want to thank everybody. Seamus, who is not here, but he stopped by and gave me the reason, and Marosh, who also is not here, but they both have good reasons, but especially Bob. Everybody's been most generous, most kind. Bob especially has made it easy for Janet and me to enjoy Christchurch in New Zealand. So thank you very much. A disclaimer: this is research that is funded by the U.S. Internal Revenue Service. So if you criticize, not that that's going to affect many of you here, but at least when I present this in the U.S., it's always a calming influence on people. If you got any problems, then just let me know, and I'll stick the IRS on you. To some extent, especially this paper that I'm going to focus on, reflects some things that the IRS wanted us to do and some constraints that we faced in the experimental design. Not a lot, but some. About 20 years or so ago, almost exactly 20 years or so ago, I was having a usual hallway conversation with a then colleague out at the University of Colorado, Bill Schulze, who was describing some of his EPA-funded work on experiments on behavior of individuals when facing low probability events. He was looking at their willingness to pay for insurance against catastrophic losses. But when the probability of the catastrophic loss was really quite low, like 1 out of 140, for example. I mean, very, very low probabilities. And I said, geez, this sounds a lot like tax compliance, because the chances of getting caught, of getting audited, really are quite low in most countries, certainly even in the U.S. But if you're caught, there can be some quite severe consequences. And Bill, some of you know Bill better than others, he's a very creative guy. He had lots of money from the EPA, and he said, okay, let's run an experiment. Go off and write some instructions. Well, I was not trained as an experimentalist, and when he said write instructions, I didn't have a clue as to what he was talking about, but he gave me some, and I wrote some, and we went back and forth, and ultimately that work was published and led to, I'm embarrassed to say, a number of additional publications. I was actually looking through my CV, kind of in anticipation, and over the last 20 years, beginning with the piece with Bill, I published about 20 papers on experimental analysis of compliance, and another 4 or 5 in conference volumes, IRS and such like that, which either, I think, reflects having a focused research agenda, or beating a dead horse, or perhaps both. So this is the final, for the moment, paper on compliance funded by the IRS with the usual disclaimers. The starting point here is a simple question: why do people pay taxes? Why do they not pay their taxes? And what I'm going to argue in the paper, or I'm going to argue in the presentation, not so much in the paper, is that the traditional theoretical empirical analyses really fall short, especially the theory falls short of a very satisfying answer. And so I will argue, and even to some extent being able to illuminate some of the questions. So what I want to argue is that experimental methods are not necessarily the only way to approach this at all. I'm not that much of a believer or an advocate for experimental, but they're another tool that can be used, and I think used usefully. And so I want to illustrate the experimental approach with a specific study, the one that was on the first page, on taxpayer services. And then I want to finish with some suggestions for future research. So this is kind of a roadmap. I want to spend most time, I think, on this issue, the specific paper that's been distributed. But I think to get there and to understand where that paper came from, it helps to understand a little bit about what came before that. And that suggests looking at a little bit at the theoretical and the empirical work on compliance. So let me start with the theoretical model. And I apologize to my colleagues from from a different floor of the business school because you've already seen this, Andrew. So my apologies. You haven't seen the specific paper I'm going to talk about, but at least this stuff is old hat to you. So the standard theory of compliance is based upon Becker's economic of crime model. The first paper on compliance, Becker's model came out in the late 60s. The first model on compliance, applying Becker's approach to evasion, was Michael Allingham and Agnar Sandmo in 1972. And really pretty much all the theoretical models, most all the theoretical models since then, within the mainstream of economics build upon that approach and apply the same basic insights. And in that model, standard expected utility maximization, again there's variance on that. Individual weighs the expected benefits of successful cheating against the risky prospects excuse me, of detection and punishment. And the individual pays taxes largely because he or she is afraid of getting caught and penalized if he doesn't, or she doesn't. And so enforcement matters in this, detection and punishment matter, but in fact, they're all that matter in this basic theory. The individual is going to pay taxes only because of the fear of detection and punishment. And so that's a useful insight, and it certainly underlies what most tax administrators around the world believe in. Enforcement matters. And I'm certainly not one to, in any of the countries in which I've done work, argue that you can get rid of the enforcement regime of the tax authority, because that doesn't make any sense. But it can't be all that matters. And that's what this theory suggests. Enforcement is all that matters. And if you actually plug in the levels of audit rates and penalty rates in virtually any income tax system or value-added tax system or business enterprise tax system or whatever you want to do, whatever tax you want to look at, into some kind of expected value maximization or expected utility maximization, the usual conclusion is, given probabilities that are relatively low, chances of getting caught are relatively low, the penalties, even if you're caught, are not all that severe, that most people should cheat most all the time. And you don't observe that. So can compliance really be explained entirely by these financial considerations? And I'd argue, no, they can't be. They can't be. Even in the U.S., for example, I always pose this question. You two cannot answer it because you know the answer. What percentage of individual income tax returns are actually subject to a very systematic audit? There's about 130 million individual income tax returns filed annually. What percentage of these returns are audited? Any guesses? 100%? Well, more than that. So usually, yeah, Phil?
No, audited or the rigorous tax compliance program audits?
Well, they don't have the TCMP anymore, but a rigorous audit. Back in the 60s, it was about 6%. Now it's less than about 0.3%. So about 3 out of 1,000 returns are audited. Now that's tending to increase a little bit lately. It might be, it reached a nadir at about 0.3%. 0.3%. I think it's gone up a little bit, but anyway, it's quite low. Now that, to some extent, either overstates the lack of audits or understates the enforcement regime, because the IRS does do a bunch of other things. They send out a variety of information returns that essentially say, Bob, you know, you reported wage income of you know, $2 million last year, and your employer says it really should have been $3 million. So you know, what's the reason for that discrepancy? Is that an audit? I'm not counting that as an audit. That's an information kind of return. So the IRS does do something like that quite frequently. And the IRS, in fact, with computerization, is relying more upon those kinds of methods. But in terms of detailed audits, virtually zero. And in most countries around the world, really quite low. I worked on a reform a couple times, 3 times in Jamaica. And much smaller country, about the population, a little bit smaller now than New Zealand. They had a pay-as-you-earn system like you do here. But over a 3-year period in the early 1980s, they audited how many returns? Do you remember? Ah, you were supposed to. This was a prompt. James, how many returns? Yeah. Ah, well, see, I went through that today. The only thing you remember is how to wipe off the blackboard, right? They audited about 100 tax returns out of about a tax-paying population of about 600,000 each year. So, I mean, virtually zero. Yeah.
With existing parameters that are around, that most people should cheat almost all the time. And I think that, I mean, I don't know whether most people cheat all of the time or not. I would suspect that anyone with a small business in New Zealand cheats all the time. Because cash is, it's having been in a small business and having done this. So
Aha!
You have this unreported cash flow.
Are there rewards for informers in? No, I'm sorry.
You have this
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
I can't do anything. I can't cheat in my tax returns here because they get cut off at source. And so that's a device which prevents me from doing it.
No, that's absolutely right. In the U.S., there are what's referred to as voluntary reporting percentages that are broken down by types of income and sector and so on. And for wage earners, the VRP is close to 100%. For farmers, for entrepreneurs, for waiters and waitresses, I guess this is not an issue here in New Zealand because except for Janet and me, nobody tips. So it does vary. In small business, even in the United States, clearly higher. But even so, the audit rates are really pretty low across the board. And so there's clearly more cheating there, but is there as much cheating as would be predicted by a standard Beckerian type of model? So what other factors might be relevant and have been examined theoretically? Well, here's a whole menu of things. And this is a fun and easy game to play, and I've played it myself in terms of looking at tax avoidance, for example, and complexity and uncertainty in alternative tax. And these are not the experimental papers I was talking about. This is the other beating a horse, a dead horse types of papers. So a lot of these things have been introduced. A lot of these factors have been introduced. But they're all within the context of the Beckerian model. And so they all end up with the conclusion, enforcement matters, pretty much all that matters, and all that introducing these more realistic features. All they really do is muddy the comparative statics. Even in the very simple models, it's sometimes hard to get clear-cut comparative statics. In the more complicated models with labor supply, with occupational choice or tax avoidance or on and on, it's hard to get clear-cut comparative static results, not surprisingly. Hard to get it in the simplest model. You complicate it, then clearly you're introducing other things. So enforcement's still the main factor. Bob?
When you say comparative static results, you're talking about the rate of compliance with regard to the probability.
Yeah. Or changing in the tax rate, or change in complexity, or the penalty rates. Well, even there, though, I mean, consider an individual, for example, an individual who can reduce taxes by either cheating, with some cost, obviously, or engaging in some costly, with certainty, tax avoidance kind of activity, tax avoidance technology. So you increase the probability of detection. What effect does that have? It may mainly change the portfolio between the mix between purely evasion and avoidance. Evasion would go down, but the tax liabilities increase. No, because the portfolio may change in such a way that the avoidance activities increase enough that still revenues go down. So that's what I mean. The comparative statics just get increasingly messy. When you start introducing endogenous audit selection rules, and I've done that mainly with people who can figure out the principal agent or the game theory stuff, because I can't. Then the comparative statics get, in the interpretation of the comparative statics, get really quite convoluted.
Can I jump in another question here?
Sure.
The way I see the enforcement thing here is an external enforcement. But there are other enforcers. Again, going back to my previous experiences, the trade-off that the group of us came to was we don't want to take out too much cash now because we may sell the business in the future, and someone's going to want to come in and see some actual cash flow. And it was an endogenous trade-off. And so the enforcement is, in good times with a good capital market, it's like, well, keep the cash flow up because we might want to sell. But in bad times, it would be bad. So there's a self-enforcement mechanism out there that I think might be
not government tax administration enforcement, but market enforcement on some of these things.
It's like that was the trade-off that we actually consciously thought of.
I can't really speak much to that. Most, I guess has not been clear, most all of this theoretical work, it's changing a little bit, most all of this theoretical work is focused on individual income tax evasion and not on businesses, not on the dynamics within businesses and so on. There's a little bit of a theoretical literature on that that's emerging. There's virtually no empirical work on that, actually I'm reviewing a paper now for my journal that looks at an experimental study on business tax evasion that seems kind of interesting. But you're right, there are other factors that may be working here. Work really hasn't focused on that. Enforcement's still the main factor. Even when you start getting beyond the standard economic approach and start adding some behavioral economics, in particular the things such as overweighting of low probabilities and so on, that helps a good bit. Extreme risk aversion, for example, can help here, but doesn't really fix things. You're still left with the notion that most people should cheat more than we observe. And so even in developing countries, where I do most of my technical assistance, I mean, there's a lot of cheating going on, don't get me wrong. But there's not quite as much as we would predict. So what else motivates compliance? Can we learn something from other literature, in particular empirical and ultimately experimental? So empirical work, what about the data? Again, almost all of this is at the individual level. Almost all of this is US. Almost all of this focuses on individual income tax and not other kinds of taxes. That's one of the suggestions for future research. Phil?
The problem is there's no watertight division between individual and business tax returns as long as there exists a Schedule C.
Your point being?
I don't know how you can create a strict dichotomy between business compliance or evasion and individual compliance or evasion.
Well, fair point.
In an institutional context.
Well, so let's keep the focus on the U.S. institutions, which is where this is coming. But even, you know, most individuals who use Schedule C, such as moi, I don't consider myself subject to the same kind of regime as business taxes, for obvious reasons. In any event, empirical work, so fair point. The main difficulty here, obviously, is that you're trying to examine something that, by its very nature, is illegal, and if people want to hide. So how do you get the numbers? Somebody once said, you know, the empirical work on tax compliance is easy, except that we don't have any measures of the left-hand side variables, compliance, and the measures that we want to use for the right-hand side variables, like probabilities of audit and so on, are not really observable either. Well, that makes it kind of hard to do empirical work. The best empirical work for the U.S. has been done using this TCMP, is what you were referring to, I think, Phil, the Taxpayer Compliance Measurement Program. These are what was referred to as the super audits back in the U.S. They began in the early 60s. They continued through 1988. And they were on a 3-year schedule after they got established, in which 50,000 individual returns were randomly sampled. Might have been stratified random sample, but nonetheless they were largely random samples so that you could reweight and adjust to reflect the entire population. These were what's used to estimate the tax gap, for example, so-called tax gap in the U.S. With these 50,000 returns, the IRS would do a detailed line-by-line audit. And so they'd say, okay, Jeremy, you reported this was your wage income. We found this paper trail, and you should have reported this. You claim this deduction, you can't document that, and so you should have claimed this. Line by line. A painful process for the 50,000 individuals who are actually subject to this. But at the end of that, what the IRS would end up with is, here's what you reported, here's what we think you reported, and the tax consequences of that gap. And almost always it was underreporting of income or overclaiming of deductions. Not always, but typically that. And so that difference is some measure of cheating, or could be used interpreted. That's what researchers tended to do. Hang on just a minute. Now, the IRS never really claimed that you could use that differential as a measure of cheating, as a measure of evasion. What they wanted to do was use that information to more efficiently target whom they actually would select for an audit. Because the IRS gets 100 million returns. All that they see on these returns is what people reported. They don't know the true items, the true reports. But they can look back at these, the statistical analysis of these 50,000 returns and say, well, we tend to observe that when this is what the individual actually reports, that is associated more probabilistically with this large subsequent cheating measure. And so we can then more efficiently say, okay, actually what the IRS would do is subject these returns to what's called a discriminant index function analysis. Don't ask me what that is. A statistical analysis that would end up allowing them to generate what's known as a DIF score, discriminant index function score, and all individual returns that are filed in any given year are funneled through the statistical formula. A DIF score is assigned, and then basically because the IRS has limited resources, they would say, okay, these numbers with these returns with these high DIF scores we're going to audit. The returns with the really low DIF scores we're not going to worry about, and we're going to cut it off somewhere in between based upon what our audit resources are. So the IRS would use this mainly to more efficiently target their resources. It is those DIF scores, for the most part, as Jeremy and I have been finding out, that the IRS has made available for researchers, not at the individual level, because there are proprietary information there, and you can't be able to identify individuals. But the IRS has made available to researchers. But for the most part, the researchers have been really only able to use the 1969 TCMP, aggregated to 3-digit zip code levels. Even though the TCMP went through 88, unless you're working for the IRS, you really can't get access to that. I'm sorry, Steve.
That's right. Did they measure underclaiming of deductions through ignorance? Because you might have that.
IRS.
You might have overclaiming of deductions through ignorance, but one looks like cheating and one just simply disappears.
The IRS makes no bones that it can't distinguish between honest mistakes and intentional mistakes.
You can have mistakes the other way, but you don't claim things that they are.
No, in fact, those kinds of overpayment of taxes, typically that information is conveyed to the taxpayer. But in terms of the TCMP, whether there is an honest, whether there's an intentional cheating or overstatement, the IRS can't tell, and it makes no claims.
If they were also looking for cases where people were overestimating their total tax bill, then you can draw some conclusions. If people only make errors on one side on average, then that tells you something. But if they're not looking for errors on the other side, then you can't say anything.
You know, what's interesting is that in the empirical research that's been done with TCMP, again, usually with the DIF score only, not the measure, sometimes with the actual measures of evasion. Whenever there is this evidence of overpayment in some form, researchers almost always simply say those people are fully honest. And so that information of overpayment is essentially thrown out. Not always. There's been a couple nice papers that have tried to say, you know, there's some informational content in these. No, absolutely right, but it hasn't really been taken into consideration.
Yeah, I don't know how much of it would be error and how much of it would just be risk aversion that you're
I think there clearly can be some of that, especially given the complexity. TCMP was essentially abolished. The last year was 1988. The IRS tried to resuscitate it unsuccessfully. They since, in 2001, implemented the National Research Program, which is essentially a scaled-down version of the TCMP. But that's pretty much the best data, and that's for 2001, and those data are not yet available for researchers. The only person who can really speak with much knowledge about the NRP is Brian Erard, who has been hired by the IRS to do the statistical analysis on the NRP. But other people don't have access to it. So, you know, what else do you do? If you can't get TCMP, you can't get NRP data, what do you do? Well, you try to find other traces of cheating in information that is available. So you might be surveys, it might be tax amnesties, it might be controlled field experiments, blah, blah, blah. None of that's particularly good, but it's been used in research. What factors have been shown here? A variety of research has looked at the impact of audit rates, of fine rates, non-financial penalties, a lot of stuff on tax amnesties. Endogenous and strategic audit selection, Brian Erard and John Feinstein have done the best work on that. Coordinated audit selection criteria of state and federal agencies. The three of us actually have a paper on that that comes from federal audits and the Oregon Department of Revenue audits, working for them. My main contribution in that research actually though was to change the acronym of the Oregon Department. The Oregon Department of Revenue was the way in which it was billed. And so I said, why don't we just get rid of the O? And maybe that's, and everybody said, okay, that's great. And that was, so my contribution to the research on that. Limitations of this empirical work. It's really hard to do. Can the compliance data really be believed? I don't think so. Even the IRS stuff, that's as good as you got. But in some sense, more importantly, suppose you do believe the numbers. Can those numbers at the individual level really identify, in a statistical sense, the independent impacts, especially of audit rates and fine rates on compliance? The fine rates are defined statutorily. Can you really get independent variation in fine rates unless you're looking at individual data over a period of time where those fine rates changed? Audit rates, there's real issues of endogeneity there. Does the IRS audit more heavily in some sectors where they think there's going to be cheating? And so, higher audit rates lead to changes in compliance. Or does the IRS look at the level of compliance in some sectors? It's a classic, which comes first in the case of crime research, police expenditures and crime rates. Can you really control for that? Really hard to do with that. And so all this, the limitations of theoretical and empirical work has led me to believe that at least there are some insights that can be gained from experimental. Now in this audience, I don't think we need to spend too much time on what is experimental economics. But the basic notion here is to try to create in a lab in economics what's comparable to what's done in the natural sciences in a laboratory, where you can change one thing at a time and therefore attribute some change in observed behavior to the institution or the incentive that you have changed. Why use experiments in compliance? Theory's got problems, empirical work's got problems. And I'm not going to argue that experimental work doesn't have some in compliance specifically doesn't have some issues, but nonetheless I think that there are some advantages to be generated from experiments. In particular, you can examine some factors that theory suggests might be relevant or policymakers think would be relevant. You can observe what people actually report. There's not an issue of data limitations, and you can change things one at a time. So, Andrea.
Before you move on to the experiments. So are there any good studies of the discrepancy between the actual audit probability and what people perceive the probability?
Yeah, mainly based on surveys. Going back to one of the earlier slides, it's interesting that when you ask, it's now a little bit old, and these are surveys that the IRS, and this is all for the U.S., I don't know what's been done elsewhere. IRS would hire some big research firms, some consulting firms like Westat, and they would do surveys of individuals. The IRS thinking, well, if the survey questions are coming from somebody identified as the IRS employee, then they're not going to be less likely to get honest answers. But they have asked questions, what do you think is the chances of you getting audit? The subjective perception. And the numbers range quite widely, but a common average in some of these earlier 1980 to 85 surveys is people believe that the chances are anywhere from about 25 to 50%. So that could be another factor that would explain why, in fact, they comply. They believe that the IRS is far more effective in detecting unreported income than they actually are. Although the flip side to that issue is that typically when you observe people, same people over a period of time who are audited by the IRS in 1990, and then their returns are examined the following year. It doesn't happen very often, but nonetheless there are some cases. Typically compliance declines over time. The audit, the original audit demystifies the process, and people say, well, you know, I thought the IRS was going to discover all this stuff, and they didn't. I can get away with this stuff. And so
Just a related question. So is the audit algorithm relatively simple? Is it pretty much random? Or, for example, the internal audit has a higher probability or higher?
depends on which audits you're talking about. The TCMP audits are those 50,000. Those were purely random, almost purely random. The more targeted diff-generated audits are not random. Those are endogenous audits, if you will, that are a function of the items that you report on your return. And that's by far the bulk of the audits. I mean, the random audits weren't happening anyway, but let's say we got a population of 100 million, and the audit probabilities of that is 0.5%. Somebody do the math. What's 0.5%? 500,000? So even if there was the full diff audit of 50,000, you know, the non-random audits are 10 times that. And there's evidence that these non-random audits, hopefully, from the IRS perspective, this is the result you get, are far more efficient in generating extra taxes. So, bottom line on experiments give control, including the generation of data and the ability to replicate things, and some flexibility in examining things one at a time. Let me skip this stuff, but let me say just a bit here before we get into the paper. What factors have been shown experimentally to affect compliance? James, Rebecca, can you, what factors? Audit rates, they saw this slide earlier today. Audit rates have been examined. Productivity of audits, meaning the efficiency of audits in actually detecting cheating. Overweighting of low probabilities, kind of indirectly. Fine rates, public disclosure of compliance. If people are audited and found to be cheating, typically that is private information, but sometimes in some experiments we say, okay, Janet Johnson, we audited you and you cheated. Here's your picture that we're going to show to everybody else in the experiment. Does that have any impact? Actually, it turns out that it does. There's some other experimental stuff on giving that shows kind of the same thing. What happens with the taxes that people pay? If they go into a public good, that has some impact on compliance. Individual rewards, including publicly provided individual rewards, has some impact. Complexity and uncertainty, blah, 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 blah. All these have been looked at, and I'm embarrassed to say that they've all been looked at not simply by me, but I have some paper on some aspect of these. I'm reminded of an old joke about Harry Johnson and George Stigler. Harry Johnson published, some reporter when they were both on the faculty at Chicago, Harry and George, some reporter, the story goes, went around talking to professors, and they said, okay, Harry Johnson, you know, how many papers have you published? And Harry said, you know, 533 or something like that. And then the reporter went to the next office, and George Stigler was there, and they asked George Stigler, how many articles have you published? And George said, 74. And the reporter said, wow, that's really impressive, but you know, your colleague, Professor Johnson, has published well over 500. And George Stigler's apocryphal response is, but mine are all different. So, well, on that note, what about taxpayer services? Have those been examined? Well, in fact, they have been. Here's this, I'll come back to that. Here is the specific study. IRS funded with colleagues Todd Cherry and Mick Jones, and especially Mike McKee. Mike was a colleague at Colorado. We've continued to work on tax compliance, especially experiments, not limited to experiments, over the years. And so this is the most recent paper. This paper is a revised and resubmitted Journal of Economic Psychology. And in fact, I got some updated results today, even today before, from Mike about some of the estimation results that are in the paper. And so that what I'm going to present is, in some sense, the new estimation results rather than the old ones. So all of you who found anomalies in the old estimation results, tough. I mean, the results have changed here, and so I'll focus on these. What we do in this paper is look at a question that was, I mean, I'll be honest, this was one that was motivated in part by the IRS wanting us to look at this issue. We looked at some other things in this research, and we've just gotten a new grant from the open-ended grant from the IRS to look at some still further issues, still more dead horse issues here. But the IRS said, look, everybody is saying, it's not uncommon to hear, that the tax code's pretty complicated. What we need to do is simplify the tax code, or what we need to do is provide some services from the tax administration to make it easier for people to pay their taxes. The IRS in the U.S. used to have call numbers, assistance desks, where you could call in. They don't really do that anymore. But they do believe that making it easier for people to pay their taxes by providing these services might be relevant. A sidebar on this. To some extent, this research was motivated also, not simply by the IRS, but at a conference that I was attending in Taipei about 3 or 4 years ago, where somebody from the Ministry of Finance was in there, and we were talking about some compliance issues. And he was very proud of a statement that he was making, that the Taiwan tax service was improving the services that they were providing to taxpayers, which I think is the right thing to do. And I raised my hand and I said, so is there any evidence that this actually has any impact on compliance? And the room got very quiet because there wasn't any evidence. And getting evidence on this from real world data might be pretty hard. So at that point I came back and Mike and I talked about it, and this research was research that is the outgrowth of that to some extent, also research though that the IRS is interested in. So the traditional approaches we talked about focuses on this enforcement paradigm, but there's also a lot of thought, Taiwanese Minister of Finance, for example, saying that we should view the tax administration as providing services to the taxpayer, a kinder, gentler tax administration. Is there much impact? Is there any observable impact of this on compliance? That might not be the only factor that should be motivated. Again, I think this is the right thing to do, but is there, what's the impact? And how does one look at that? And that's what we try to do. We use experimental procedures, laboratory experiments to test the effectiveness of taxpayer service programs in enhancing compliance. I'm not going to argue that the way in which we've done this in the paper really fully captures this. I don't think we do, but I think it's suggestive. Yeah, Bob.
So it is the paradigm designed to address two different motivations.
Mm-hmm.
One designed to get at avoidance, and the other designed to get at making mistakes. The service paradigm is designed.
I don't know that I would distinguish between avoidance and evasion in that way. I think one is they have fundamentally different views of the tax. They have fundamentally different views of the taxpayer. One is the enforcement paradigm. Views the taxpayer as a cheat, as a criminal, and we need to stop that. The other views the taxpayer more as a customer, and we're trying, in this view, we're trying to be a more service-friendly provider of information. So I don't know that it's evasion and avoidance. I think it's just a different view of what is the. It's a different view of the taxpayer. One is as a cheat, one is as a customer, and we need to make it easier for them to pay their taxes. Okay. Specifically, what we look at in the paper are how are an individual's filing decisions and subsequent reporting decisions affected by tax agency provision of information in an environment where there's some uncertainty about what is the individual's true tax liability. In some sense, then, the services improve compliance. If it were up to me, we would have taken the filing decision out of this work and focused only on the reporting. But you know, you take somebody's money and there's sometimes some restrictions on what you can do. Our basic experimental setting mimics, I think, there's a certain parallelism to the experimental setting, parallel in the real world. Subjects earn income. In some other experiments, we just gave people money. They earn income. I'll go through these in more detail. They have to choose whether to file a tax return. And then conditional upon filing, they have to choose how much to report. A filing compliance decision, a reporting compliance decision. In that basic setting, we complicate things. We make some features that are relevant to the individual's choices uncertain. And we then provide services from the tax administration, us, the experimenter, that allows subjects to compute more easily their tax liabilities. And what we see in this is a little bit of an impact. Not a lot, but some impact, but only in some dimensions. We find that provision of information doesn't really affect the filing decision. Do you file or not? It does affect the reporting decision conditional upon filing. Excuse me, in a positive way, but not in a large way. I think this is suggestive evidence. It's not conclusive. In particular, let me go through this. The theory, and there are some equations. You got to have some equations in a paper. There are some in there, but the essence of it is pretty straightforward. It is. I say kind of because it's not entirely straightforward to demonstrate this. That if you improve tax administration services that reduce uncertainty and complexity, then people will pay more. The actual comparative statics are a little messier than one might think, and the pure theory can generate different results on whether or not reducing uncertainty improves compliance or not. One of my very first papers on this issue was a theoretical piece that demonstrated that essentially there are conflicting income and substitution effects with uncertainty, and they can go in opposite directions. But that particular complication aside, there should be some impact. And so what we do is to design experiments to look at this. In particular, the basic experimental steps. These figures refer to the screens. I'll show them in a minute. The first step, we allow people to earn income. There's a task. Not a particularly complicated task, but a task nonetheless. The notion being that there might be different behavior with income that is given to individuals where there's not a sense of ownership of that income versus income that they do some task, not a technical task, but some task to earn it. This was a feature the IRS wanted. I think it's a reasonable feature. And we came up with, I think, a clever way to have that income earned. I'll look at that in a minute. In step 2, the individuals learn details of the specific fiscal system that they face. I'll show you the screen there. They can choose to obtain a tax form or not. They can choose to file a tax return or not. And then they have to choose if how much income they're going to report if they file. There's some audit procedure that, and I'll show this. This is a purely random audit procedure. This is not anything like a diff, an endogenous audit. They receive some information at the end of the round about what their payoffs are, and so they see exactly what their income is in that round and what their accumulated income is. The round ends and we go to another round. Basic experimental design. Some specific features here. We think that, and this is the IRS influence, that there is a reasonable job of creating this parallelism that in order to believe that your experimental results have at least some relevance to the real world is necessary. In some other experimentalists don't like this, but we in fact use tax terminology. We use the words audit rather than more neutral terms like checks. We use reporting, non-reporting, things like that, rather than disclosing. More neutral terms. And the very first paper with Bill Schultze, in fact, used neutral terms, more in the tradition of real experimentalists. And then we also, though, compared those results with using the tax terminology. And somewhat surprisingly, in retrospect, we got identical, like down to the third decimal point in terms of compliance between the neutral and the loaded terms. So that paper actually gets a lot of citations, but it's mainly for that reason, because it allows people to use tax terminology, and especially accountants and people don't use that. I'm not using that word pejoratively here. Like have a much stronger preference for the use of tax terminology than the neutral terminology. We allow people to earn income, as I indicated. There is a filing decision, there is a reporting decision, and there are some complications. I'll look at that before. So these are all, I think, consistent with parallelism. Do we duplicate, replicate exactly real-world conditions? No. You can't do that. You probably shouldn't do that in the lab because that makes it too complicated. But I think there are some reasonable elements here. We impose the same tax rate in all sessions. We don't vary that. We're not looking at how compliance responds to tax rate. We're not looking at how penalty rate on unreported income, if you are audited, affects things. We've done that in other words. I would have liked to have had a larger penalty rate here, but well, whatever. We allow the audit rate to vary within sessions. These are higher than clearly real-world experience. We needed, and I would like to have seen more variation here as well, say 20%, 40%, 60%. We needed some variation here, but we needed to have it at a reasonably high level in order to at least come close to generating the condition that individuals should report income, should file and report income. We didn't get to that, as Stephen pointed out. It's still optimal to cheat. But with audit rates of 30 and 40%, it becomes a little bit closer. We don't use the tax revenues or the penalties to provide anything. So this is not a public good contribution game. It's effectively a double blind. There's no communication between students. We pay them in private. The audit process is a random process. We don't announce things. It's single blind because there's no communication between students, and it's double blind because there's really very little impact of the investigator on the student, on the subject choices. At least we make that argument. It's not quite double blind, but it's pretty close. Interestingly, and this will be another paper, not simply in this paper, but in some other ones that we've done. The pool of subjects was students, which is pretty common, but we also use some real people. Sorry about that. We used some staff. We had to pay them a little bit more, but students are, old joke. Why do you use student subjects rather than, let's say, animals, like pigeons and rats and guinea pigs, like Ray Battaglio, the great Ray Battaglio would use? Because students are cheaper, and you don't get attached to students. Students don't necessarily appreciate that joke, but so another paper, this will be with Kim Bloomquist at the IRS, where he's done actually some TCMP data, some NRP data, excuse me, where we will try to generate some external validity of our results. The preliminary results on students versus staff is that staff actually comply a little bit more, but not significantly more. So if there's a concern that all of our data are not to be believed because we are using student subjects and students aren't real people, again, there's some evidence that it doesn't really matter. And there's evidence from other areas where students and non-student subjects don't generate significant differences. And that actually should be your expectation, I think. I think it's to believe that there should be different results is to argue that the cognitive processes of students and non-students is different. I think the burden should be on people who make that argument rather than on people who believe that there shouldn't be. Yeah, Steve?
Just relating to the staff subjects, are those your colleagues? Are those people that you know? Are they,
These were staff.
So the reason I'm saying that is because you said that
No.
staff has greater compliance, and
Is there more?
we can talk about it later, but I don't believe in your double blind design. So I'm thinking that the staff, right, since they had higher compliance, they know you're going to look at it, and they are afraid to look like,
We ended up with over about 130 subjects, about half and half. So we couldn't all use, say, econ staff for the staff. This was staff. These experiments were run, I don't know if this is in here, at a major state university. This was at Appalachian State, if you believe Appalachian State is a major state university, I guess. They did beat, you got any Michigan graduates here? They did beat Michigan in football a while back. So I guess that makes them kind of a major institution. But those approximately 60 staff were from all throughout the university. It was not simply, you know, Janet and Carolyn who sat in on the experiment. So this was, and they were recruited, not being told what the purpose of the experiment was. No.
Did the human subjects committee approve that?
Yeah, of course. Using staff, why would they object?
You're supposed to receive a written statement indicating roughly what direction the research is heading.
That's correct. All these experiments are consistent with the ethical treatment of animals and staff and even students. So it did get approval there. All the experiments are computerized. Some complications. Here's the complications. And here's where we really capture the complexity and the service provision of the IRS. I'm not sure. I'm not entirely convinced, but I think it's a first step. The individual's earned income is subject to a deduction, subtraction. And so the tax value of a deduction is the 35% times the deduction that you take, plus a credit, which is a dollar for dollar or token for token offset against the taxes. The deduction we set at 15%. The credit's a declining function of earned income. We used actually a couple different income credit schemes. One that was targeted only to low-income individuals, and one that was for which everybody was eligible. And so this is kind of consistent with, in the U.S., the earned income tax credit. I don't know if there's something comparable here. There's uncertainty in some settings about deductions and credits. What we did was we told people the average value of the deduction is this, the mean value, but there is some variation within that, around that average value, that is the true value of the deduction or the credit that you will be allowed at the end of if there is in fact an audit. So we told them the mean, we told them the variation, the spread, uniform distribution. They are told only the means and their ranges. If no information is provided, then the participants learn the true values of what they actually report, and they're these uncertain values, after they've filed their taxes. But we provide some information in some settings. We allow them, at some cost, we'd like to vary the cost to try to get some willingness to pay for information, future research, another paper. Subjects can click on a button on the screen and the true levels of the deduction and the credit are revealed. Not in all settings, but in some. So does this really capture the uncertainty, the complexity that individuals face in their filing their taxes? I think it captures some of it, but we can't put the entire 1040 return on the computer screens and allow people to play around with that. There's some limitations in what you can do experimentally on this. I think this gets at some of these issues, some uncertainty, but probably not all of them. Also, we run these labs. This was in Appalachian State, in Boone, North Carolina. Network computers. This is the Mike McKee set-up laboratory. Major state university, Appalachian State. Online recruiting system was used. Well, earnings averaged $18 for student subjects and $28 for staff for about a 90-minute. That's reasonable pay for the students, a little bit low for staff, even in North Carolina. Sorry. Experiments last about 90 minutes. Yep.
Can you just run by me why you introduced uncertainty into both deductions and credits? I'm just trying to get my head incentives that are facing these people here. You're saying I earned some money. I don't know what my deduction is going to be, but you're telling me, oh, it could be anywhere in this range, and there's a median. And then also, there's going to be some credits coming your way in terms of income, but you don't know what those are either.
Right.
So it's kind of like some noise tacked onto my effort.
That's exactly what we were trying to do. We were trying to put some noise in there and see how people would respond. First, to the noise itself, there is some theory on that, and actually the experimental results we get are a little different than what my theory predicted in any event. But then we wanted to resolve that noise, to remove that noise and see with the provision of official information to see whether or not that had some impact. So that's all we were trying to do, just provide the noise. Is this really capture the true noise, the true uncertainty individuals have when they're sitting down on April 15th before midnight and trying to figure out what taxes to pay? Well, I think it captures some of these elements, but I'm not going to argue that this is the parallelism is complete here. I'm not sure what else we could have done with this, given restrictions from the IRS about what they wanted us to look at. And there's some things in here that this is a kind of a messy design. There's a lot of stuff going on in here. In some sense, having uncertainty only about, say, deductions would have made it a little bit easier to interpret these results. What we're really, a criticism that we get from, not from psychologists who review this, but from, at least that's what I'm hoping, when they get the revision back at Journal of Economic Psychology, but from economists, is that there's too many things going on. It's too messy a design. In some sense, I think that's a plus, though, in this case. If there really is that a lot of fuzziness about this, and there's a way of resolving that uncertainty, then this is what that's trying to capture. Bob?
So, and don't answer this, you're going to just address it in the very next slide, but is the decision of the taxpayer is not whether to claim perhaps too many deductions or?
All three.
All three.
And actually, there's 5 decisions. Do you get the form or not? Once you get the form, do you file or not? You don't have to. If you file the form, if you file a return, if you, on April 15th at midnight, you actually go to the post office and mail it, how much income do you report? How much deductions do you claim? How much credits do you claim? A lot going on here. And economists typically would interpret this as saying, what you're really testing, and I don't have a good response to this, what you're really testing is the ability of people to calculate compound lotteries. And we know that people aren't very good at that, especially students on this thing, for Pete's sake, but the staff either, for that matter. Yeah, so there are a lot of decisions that are involved here. So there is some complexity and uncertainty. Is it really quite the same as what's going on with tax returns? I don't know. Let's look at the results. Yeah.
Yeah, I like the idea of estimating the reduced fund effects of service provision, but I still am wondering about what's underlying and the estimated audit probability is still a big factor for me. So
Well, the subjects are told what the audit probabilities are.
But if you get individualized information, that to me suggests that the IRS takes their facts together. And I well, in New Zealand, for example, this year, you can read the and the website was supposed to go live at the beginning of August, and at the end of August, so it's working. I thought, well, why would I bother when they don't start? My estimate possibility of any trouble and breakdown.
We're not looking at that aspect, I guess, is the argument that I would make. There is complete certainty about what the tax rate is, for that matter, what people's earned income is after they do the task, about what the probabilities, what the fine rate is. The only uncertainty is about, well, what's the old Donald Rumsfeld line? There's known unknowns, and there's unknown knowns, and there's unknown unknowns, or something along those lines. the chances of getting audited, that's a known unknown in some sense. They know that probability. They know the expected value of their, we're not varying the probability. We could. That's actually something the IRS wants us to look at, some endogenous rules, but we didn't do that in this one. So here's the earnings scheme, the task that they had to do. They're given these numbers. They have to click on these and move them over here in order. The person who does it first gets the highest income, 100 tokens. The person who does it slowest gets the lowest. Usually there's 8 people in these experiments. They get the lowest of 10 or 20 tokens, increments of 10. There's some work experimentally that tries to look, and Stephen knows more about this than me, tries to look at labor supply choices in the lab. I don't really find that work very convincing. This is not a labor supply decision, don't get me, so don't interpret it in that. This is simply a task that the individuals undertake in order to allow them to claim some ownership of their income. We've also done these types of experiments where we give people income. And what we find is that there's a little bit more cheating in these kinds of experiments where they earn their income. Not too surprising. But the responses tend to be the same. Steve?
So with this, it was turn and play, right? So whoever was the fastest got the highest.
Yep.
I presume you did it that way because you wanted to have set N at different levels of income, is that right?
That's correct.
I mean, there's a trade-off there, the turn and play is like the behavioral aspect not the best, right? And then that might be
Well, there's some interdependence. I guess this might be one of your concerns about the double blind. Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough.
Well, I was just curious.
Yeah, that's what's going on here. Here's the income. So they earn their income.
That's not public information.
Well, they do know where they are, and they know the distribution of income. So they can figure out, well, if my income is 60, then I'm the 4th fastest person in here.
The screen right there, right? You see they're doing 4.
This one right here, after they earn their income, this is the information that they give. So this is full information. Here is information about what the tax rate is and what the audit probability is in that round. We vary the audit rates randomly within rounds. Everybody faces a 30 or 40% sometime during the, how many rounds did we have? 20 or 25. These experiments take a little longer to run because they have that earning process at the beginning of each round. Each round. This is not, they earn income and that's the same income that they have for the whole experiment. So each round they do that. Don't worry about these. In some other experiments, we have a social insurance program. In some other experiments, we varied the efficiency of the audit, so audit success. So this is kind of a generic screen. Some of these things don't apply. And here's the form, buy it or not. Here it is in particular. Costs some money to get the form. Screen A4. Here is what happens when there is a deduction. So here is your earnings versus others. Your deduction that's allowed. Is there uncertainty in here? No. This is where there's no uncertainty. Here is the time that they have available. All these are kind of timed experiments, and here is your decision to file or not file. And here's the audit process. In previous ones we've done with the mechanical bingo cage, where you got, don't laugh. You got ping pong balls in there, white ones and red ones or blue ones in this case, and you roll it and a subject comes up and pulls one out, and if it's a blue one, you're audited or everybody's audited, and if it's a white one, then no one is. The beauty of this is that only the individual knows whether he or she is audited. I think that argues a little bit for the double blind. You could vary the audit rate within a round for a different individual. So this is the 30% audit rate because there's 3 blue ones and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 white ones. Glad that worked out. We could change that to 4 or 5 or whatever we wanted it to be. And so at the audit process, we push a little button and the balls kind of bounce around there in the, on the computer screen, and one of them comes out the top, whether or not it's white or blue. So what are our treatments? How long do I have here? It's about 5:30, is that right? Okay.
You're off. We leave at 4:30. You can say
430. Okay, well, that's fine. We're getting there. These are no information service, excuse me, no uncertainty and uncertainty. Here is then the third basic treatment. Uncertainty is present on deductions and credits, and there is information that is provided by the tax agency. Obviously, when there's no uncertainty, the provision of information is irrelevant, so we didn't do that one. So three basic treatments. Experimental parameters, we've gone through this. Here is the income tax credit. The function of this income is your earned income. Maximum income was 100. This is one that's targeted more at low-income individuals because there's a steeper benefit reduction rate. The deduction says 20% rather than 15%. Who made up these slides? It should be 15% rather than 20%.
How does the fine rate work? Like, what would be an average fine?
In the experiment or in?
The experiment.
If you are audited and found to be if you file and you are audited and found to be non-compliant, and you didn't report, say, let's do the math here. You didn't report 10 tokens, either because of deductions or credits, or then the unpaid taxes should have been on that would be $350, and the penalty on that would be $350 times 1.5, whatever that is, 5.25. That would be what the penalty would be extracted from you. That would be subtracted from your balance before you go to the next round. Okay. Okay.
Just because these people, I mean, I'd be curious to see what it feels like to get audited. I mean, I play this game and you pay a buck to get the information, and you kind of wonder, well, let me try this first where I get to that and see what happens.
Well, we always start with practice rounds where people can play around with this.
Econometrics prof, found cheating in experiment.
They are allowed to play around. For that matter, before they file their return, they're allowed to type in different values for deductions and credits and earned income to see what the consequences would be for their taxes. You know, I don't know if we include on that information, this would be the consequences if you are in fact audited. I don't know I don't believe we do that, but that's the way that it's calculated here. Results. Okay, distinguish filing and reporting behavior. We're pulling everybody together, all the staff and the students. The separate results, you'll have to wait till I go on the Tonight Show. Well, probably not the Tonight Show, given not on the Letterman. Yeah, Letterman's not the but you have to wait till the next paper before you get the broken down results. That'll be with Kim Bloomquist. So what do these results look like? Uncertainty concerning the tax liability, deductions, credits, income. Deductions and credits. Results in lower reporting compliance rates, as we'll see. So if there's, compared to the no uncertainty setting, everything else is constant, level of reported income goes down. A little bit contrary to at least some theory, not all theory, but some theory. So with uncertainty, the overall, remember this is reporting, this isn't filing. The overall reporting compliance is about 62%, and that's lower than 67% without uncertainty. When the tax authority, the experimenter, provides information, then you basically recover the initial no uncertainty compliance plus a little bit. So uncertainty lowers compliance, providing information increases it.
So are you able to tease out errors if it's more difficult? So are you always with the smooth regimes where it's additional difficulty and uncertainty? I presume that it's easier to make errors, right, when you're doing calculations, or I may have missed that. So here, right, when you give them additional information, it's just easier to calculate. Could it be that they're just making fewer errors?
Fewer errors in what sense?
So they just calculated their return wrong, or their
There's no individual calculations here. The computer calculates everything. Once they type in a number, and this is what they're allowed to play around with, Bob, to some extent in response to your question. They're allowed to type in different, before they click on the return, on the file button, they type it in, and the computer will display what the tax consequences of those decisions are. So there's no error in that sense. Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly right. You don't know whether or not it's going to be at the upper end or the lower end or the median level. And so
It says nothing about how much deduction you can claim. It says you can claim somewhere.
it has to be within the range that's allowable.
Okay.
Yeah. And that restriction is imposed. So you can't overclaim or underclaim within that range.
People tend to aim at the middle of the distribution?
Yeah, they tended to, risk neutral behavior, but not always, not always. And we haven't really broken down the way in which the unreporting occurs. This would be something we should look at. Does it occur with the credits? Does it occur with the deductions? Does it occur, and there's no uncertainty about true income, but does it occur with people underreporting their income? Maybe they all tend to, again, we haven't looked at it, choose the mean value of deductions. This might be my strategy if I were doing mean value of deductions, mean value of credits, but I'm playing around with, I know what my true income is, and so I tend to underreport that. I don't know. I don't know what those numbers show. It's worth looking at. The filing behavior doesn't move at all with uncertainty or with the provision of information. What's the explanation for that? I don't have a good explanation. Regardless, though, the effects tend to be pretty small throughout all this. Jeremy?
Just a question about the audit probability. Is that regardless of whether you filed or not?
If you don't file,
Can you still be audited if you haven't filed?
hang on. No, you can't.
So
That fair point, but let's look at the numbers because I think this is a question that Steve might have. Here is the filing rate. No uncertainty, uncertainty with information. These are pretty high filing rates. And in fact, here's the reporting compliance. Those are the 67%, 62, and 70%. One of the comments we've gotten from people, and we don't have great answers for this, is why should anybody file a return? Why should anybody file a return?
Well, it's optimal decision. If you were just caring about maximizing the return, should you file with 30% probability, 20%? Does it depend on income? Who is following down the strategy?
No, it's a random. I mean, once it's 30%, it's 30% for everybody or 40% for everybody. There's not any endogeneity there. I will be honest, that's an anomaly.
It's more, for some folks, depending on your level of income, it might be worth taking the gamble on not filing at all, because the expected penalty can be fairly low, given your earnings.
Well, I mean, the penalty is the same percent. The probabilities can vary. The probabilities of audit can vary.
Fixed fee to get the form.
Yeah. The cost of the form tends to be pretty low. The reason that we put essentially the zero probability. Think about not filing, put it this way. Think about not filing. In most countries, and I'll make some reference to some empirical work I've done in Jamaica. In most countries, if you don't file, your chances of getting caught are zero. Not at all, but even in the U.S. The U.S. has a separate program that's targeted toward non-filers, but it's a pretty small program. In most countries, in Jamaica, for example, where I have some numbers, I have some information, if you are not in the system, your chances of getting audited are zero. If you're in the system, the chances of getting audited are pretty small, but at least they're non-zero. In fact, we did some empirical work in Jamaica, this is now a little bit old, that got lists of active professionals or active small business owners. Professionals included accountants, doctors, lawyers, architects, I forget the fifth category. And we went to the professional organizations and we asked them, can you give us a list of those who are still active? So you might imagine when they said, okay, we can do that, but why do you want it? And we said, well, we're working on a tax reform project. Well, that was a tough argument to make. But what we did then was take those names and go to the income tax department and see whether or not these people filed. These are people who were vouched by their organization as being active. They should have filed a return. They did not. These are people with non-PAYE income. And in the way the Jamaican system works, I'm assuming it's the same way as in New Zealand. If you got non-sources of PAYE income, you have to file a return. At least that's the way it worked in Jamaica. These were people who should have filed. We found that about 1 in 5 of these professionals actually filed a return. We repeat, 1 in 5 filed a return. 4 in 5 did not. We repeated this for small business owners, such as gas station owners and beauty shops, and the small convenience stores. And what we found was 1 in 10 actually filed returns. 9 out of 10 did not. What were the chances? And actually, after the fact, we gave all this information to the income tax department. We went back 5 years later and said, so what's happened with all these names? We took those names and, what's happened with all these names? We haven't done anything with them. All the data was sitting in a filing cabinet gathering dust. All of this to say, if you don't file, your chance of getting audited is pretty low. In the real world, in this case, virtually zero. So why should anybody file? I don't know. I don't know. Is this pro-social behavior that Steve Levitt and John List have talked about, or Bram Cadsby, obedience to authority? It's possible. On the other hand, what about other kinds of experiments in games, looking at ultimatum games or public good contribution games, or people in here who've done these. And what you tend to observe in those is far more social behavior, and this is the origin of the Levitt and List critique, than is predicted by the theory. So this is higher than we thought it would be, clearly.
Expected being 0 in every one of those cells.
Should be, yeah. Should be.
Okay. So it's always payoff maximizing to not file.
Yep.
What level of risk aversion do you need to induce this?
Depends on which theory you want. If you go with the Bernasconi approach, it still has to be pretty high. But there's a nice paper by I forget the first name. Levels of risk aversion. Let me go ahead here. So what we did, that's aggregate. Those are the means. What we then did was look at the individual level of compliance, whether it's filing a tax form or reporting income. So Y is a 0, 1 variable for the filing in a proportion, reported income over true income. We didn't break it down by credits and deductions. That might be interesting work to do. Look at that compliance. And we estimated that as a function of the tax form cost, the income in that round. Wealth is essentially accumulated earnings. That should be a lagged wealth from the previous period. The audit probability, whether there's uncertainty, a dummy variable for those sessions. Whether the information is provided, that's another dummy variable. And this is a dummy variable for whether or not the income tax credit is a low income tax credit, I believe, was the category. Yeah. And then we estimated this with some panel methods. This is where I've gotten some new results. And the new results, though, what I just told you. The new results, the relevant ones, I think, are these. What does uncertainty do? It reduces the tendency to file, but not in a significant way. These are the p-values. The provision of information has a positive impact on filing, but not statistically significant. Where you get a little bit of kick is on the compliance rate. With uncertainty, the reporting rate goes down. With information provision, the reporting rate goes up. Some of these other variables probably look a little bit, audit probability. Higher audit probability has a positive impact on filing and on reporting. Those are both significant. Some of the demographics are semi-interesting. Men tend to be less compliant than women, at least in this experiment. If you prepare your own taxes, you tend to be more compliant, but not statistically significant. If you're claimed as a dependent, that has some impact. So, conclusion. For the reporting model, uncertainty lowers compliance rate. Provision of information resolves that uncertainty to some extent. For the tax form filing, there's still this anomalous result about why people are filing at all. But what we find is that uncertainty doesn't do too much. So, yeah, these are the demographics we went through. Conclusions. What happened to my conclusions? I guess this is it. Conclusions on this particular study is that individuals report less when their liability is uncertainty, but most of that's offset with information. Filing decision doesn't have much impact, and so IRS service provision may have some, at least possible impact on reporting but not filing, but we still, I think to make a convincing case in the filing, have to come up with a better explanation of why people file at all. We haven't done that. So conclusions more generally, and here's where I'll quit. I won't go to future research, given the, unless I have till 5:30. Well, you know, if I speak in an empty room, is there really sound coming out? I don't know. Detection and punishment have to be present. This is what I've referred to in other work as an enforcement paradigm. But other tools probably are useful as well, whether or not it's services or whether the existence of trust in these institutions. Didn't really talk about that, but some other work gets at that. So what this suggests to me is effectively there's multiple paradigms for tax administration. There's this traditional enforcement paradigm. It's got to be present. You've got to have detection and punishment. But there should be also, I think, the recognition that people respond to some extent to services, at least as suggested by these results. And there's some other results, not in this paper, but in some other ones, that I'm not the only one who's done experimental work on compliance, that if there is greater trust in the institutions doing the auditing, or in government more broadly, that people will tend to comply more. And so all this leads me to the notion that it really should be a full house of strategies to address these full house of behaviors. And this notion of a full house is actually some terminology that seems to resonate a lot with IRS individuals. This comes from a paper by the late, great Stephen Jay Gould, who wrote a book, Full House. He was a Harvard biologist, evolutionist, who, based upon some personal experiences of his own, that involved him looking at averages, but then also looking at variation of averages within that population, led him to conclude that it is misleading to try to characterize a system by averages. It's especially misleading to characterize the way in which a system evolves over time or responds to influences by looking at an average or representative kind of behavior. Instead, what Gould argued is that systems, in the context of biology, the way systems evolve is not by the change in the average behavior, but essentially the change at the extremes. I think that analogy is particularly apt for compliance. He argued that there's a full house of behavior in the natural world, in the biological world. I'd argue that there's a full house of behaviors in the compliance world. There are people who are always honest, file their returns, even when they shouldn't. There are people who are always cheating, even when the incentives should flip them over. There are people who maximize expected value. There are people who are guided by morality and guilt and social norms. There are people who flip back and forth depending upon how they feel that particular day. And so what you really need is a full house of strategies, enforcement, services, trust, to address this full house of behaviors. And focusing only on one element, one of those triads in that stool, if you would, is not a useful strategy. And the IRS seems to buy this for the most part. And in fact, this notion of a full house is starting to get incorporated in some other research, at least by the people who fund this research. They like the full house stuff. So I have some other slides in here, but I don't feel like talking to myself.
Thanks very much, Jim. Unfortunately, we are out
Thank you very much.